Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Policy Beats. Today we are joined with Maha Hussain, and she is a research associate at RSIL. She completed her undergrad law degree from the University of Cambridge, and at RSIL her work centers around select issues in public international law, climate finance, and counterterrorism. So thank you so much, Maha, for taking out the time. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to speak to you.
So first of all, why international law?
So this is something that I think a lot of lawyers don't consider international law as a career. But when I was studying in my undergraduate degree, it was by far the most interesting module. And then I started thinking, okay, what opportunities are there in this beyond studying? And as I looked through, I found myself getting more interested in the area and then also finding interesting roles to take up in international law. So when I came back to Pakistan, I joined RSIL, and since then we've just been looking at a lot of different areas, and I've also tried to branch out beyond just public international law. Now I look a lot at climate change and environmental law, so that's been really interesting for me because it gives me the chance to constantly learn.
Well, that's amazing. लेकिन एक चीज़ मैं जानना चाहूँगी, when people, मतलब for example, people who are not studying international law या वो उस चीज़ में उस तरह से partake नहीं कर रहे, तो the first thought that comes to at least others would be कि अच्छा कश्मीर के बारे में होगा, territorial disputes होंगे, something along the lines of trade agreements, etc. But you're choosing to work on climate, which is relatively a new field. There's no existing, I believe, laws, I could be wrong, like the existing legal order for the climate change issues, environmental law in general, given abhi jis tarah tezi se we're facing the impact of climate change. How do you think in Pakistan हम इस चीज़ को push कर सकते हैं? For example, जैसे there's a point of discussion here about right to safe and healthy environment. So keeping that point in mind, what sort of legal efforts need to be put in place actually happening within Pakistan that we may not necessarily know about?
So you're definitely right that climate change or environmental issues pe itna, we haven't started the conversation. We're only now getting to it, and we're way behind than where we need to be. Like you said, we're facing these climate change impacts last year with the flooding that took place, and this year with the upcoming monsoons. It's likely that we'll be in a similar position in terms of disasters. So for that, I think Pakistan definitely needs more young professionals focusing on climate change, and that could be in any area, be it in policy making. So there's a real need for data-driven, evidence-based decision making, jo ke I think the government is focusing on more now, lekin it's still not enough. And then also definitely climate finance, looking at how we can move towards green finance. And even in the private sector. So in my mind, climate change is this thing that affects absolutely everything. So when we think of it, we also need to see how we can ensure that every area of our intervention addresses climate change. So I don't think that it's only the job of the legal system to deal with it, but it's also the job of businesses to adapt, of individuals to, in their entrepreneurship, in their individual politics, activism, to take up this cause, because it affects so many different things. And with the right to a healthy environment, that is a international movement to recognize that a safe, clean and healthy environment is a human right. So this was not something that was, I think, recognized maybe 50 years ago, but the movement for it started in 1972 with the Stockholm Declaration. So in that, they said that human beings have a right to live with dignity. And then this concept of dignity is expanded. It's not just you have the right to be alive through your right to life, but it means that you should have a safe place to live, clean access to drinking water, a safe environment where your life expectancy isn't being reduced because of the environment you're living in. And Pakistan mein to this has been in conversation since 1994.
Okay.
So in 1994, and I think this is one thing जो कि पाकिस्तानियों को पता ही नहीं है, तो internationally इन चीज़ों पे बातें हो रही हैं, and we always think कि अच्छा this is an international movement, it doesn't involve Pakistan, but actually Pakistan में ये this has been recognized a lot earlier than a lot of other states.
We have no idea about it.
Exactly.
I had no clue.
1994 में there was the Shela Zia versus Wapda case.
Okay.
तो उसमें Pervez Hassan, the lawyer, used arguments that actually our right to life in the Constitution needs to be looked at in a broader sense than just being alive. So in that he said that we should connect the right to life to the right to live with dignity, and dignity mein hi we bring all of these other aspects. So and these are things that are in Pakistan's constitution, the right to dignity in Article 14. So these are things that Pakistan has been trailblazing on, but we just don't talk about it. So I definitely think that what we need in Pakistan is really to promote these indigenous ideas and then talk about how Pakistan's best practices can be shared internationally as well. So with the right to a clean, healthy environment, it's made up of a lot of different rights. So there's your substantive rights, so you should have clean water, you should have a clean environment, you should be safe from hazardous substances, toxic wastes, and that you should have a stable ecosystem with biodiversity. And if you look at all of these things, these are things that in Pakistan they're all really a threat. But then there are also your procedural rights. So those are decision making mein your average person should be able to be involved in that. So they should have access to information, the ability to take part, so public participation, consultation, and also the access to justice. तो जब उनके environmental rights violate होते हैं, so they should be able to go to the courts and get some sort of remedy for that. So in my opinion, the way that Pakistan can really move forward on this is to implement the laws we already have in place. Because our environmental laws are quite progressive. जो लिखा हुआ होता है, it's I think better than a lot of different countries. But the issue is then in enforcement. कि ये लिखा हुआ होता है, but actually does the average person know कि ये laws हैं उनको protect करने के लिए, and are these laws being implemented by enforcement bodies?
On the case of enforcement, क्योंकि पाकिस्तान में ऐसे लगता है कि कुछ साल पहले हुआ था, लेकिन अभी भी कभी बात होती है टू स्टॉप यूजेज ऑफ प्लास्टिक. जैसे प्लास्टिक बैग्स को बैन कर दिया गया था, एंड बहुत सख्त जो है इसको फॉलो किया जा रहा था. एटलीस्ट बड़े स्टोर्स में, छोटे स्टोर्स में पेपर बैग्स और वी सॉ कपड़ों के बैग्स एज वेल. लेकिन फॉर सम रीज़न दैट थिंग ऑल्सो डिड नॉट सस्टेन. मतलब हम लोग एक प्लास्टिक बैग रिमूवल भी नहीं कर पाए इंटायरली. टेक्निकली अभी भी we're still, there's like a crazy usage of it. हम सबके घरों में अभी भी जो है ना प्लास्टिक बैग्स हमने स्टॉक करके रखे हैं in case फिर ये प्रॉब्लम हो जाती है, right? Because एक तो you're able to we find the best use case through that. So how do you then convince people? ठीक है, एक तो बात हो रही है कि इंटरनेशनल लीगल उसमें एक बात चल रही है, डिस्कशन चल रही है, लेकिन ले पर्सन जिसकी बेसिक नीड उसको नहीं लगता कि शायद प्लास्टिक रोकना उसके लिए अच्छा है. एक तो हाउ डू वी कन्विंस, और दूसरा जो हमारे ये ब्रेक्स के साथ इम्प्लीमेंटेशन आती है या इन्फोर्समेंट आती है, हाउ डू यू फील कि इट कैन बी पुश्ड फॉरवर्ड विद मोर विगर परहैप्स, कि उसकी इम्प्लीमेंटेशन सही तरह से की जाए, या आपके नज़दीक ऐसी क्या वजह है कि इतनी बेसिक चीज़ जो थी ऑफ रिमूवल प्लास्टिक बैग्स वो भी हम पूरी तरह से उसको कमिट नहीं कर सके. एंड दिस ऑल्सो ब्रिंग्स मी टू द पॉइंट ऑफ द लीगली बाइंडिंग इंस्ट्रूमेंट दैट वी डिस्कस्ड अर्लियर ऑन इन आवर कॉन्वर्सेशन वाज द प्लास्टिक पोल्यूशन का इशू, एंड देन वी टेक इट टू द मरीन एनवायरनमेंट देन.
दिस प्लास्टिक इशू इज़ समथिंग जो पाकिस्तान में काफ़ी सालों के लिए, डेकेड्स के लिए बात हो रही थी, बट we, like you said, implementation is there some years and then sometimes it disappears. So I think one of the big issues in this is the way that we're approaching the law. So in regulations, all of these bans, what they do is that they create a deterrent. So they say if you manufacture plastic bags, then there will be a fine of 1 million rupees. If you're a shopkeeper who uses plastic bags, then 10,000 rupees. If you're an individual who is taking a plastic bag, 1,000 rupees. But the issue then is the deterrent is there, but ensuring that people are aware of it or that they actually follow through with it, I don't think that's been there. So I think there needs to be more effort on the provincial government level to ensure that they can enforce this. And I think one way to do that is you build a public consciousness. तो अगर आप लोगों को कहें कि आप plastic bags मत इस्तेमाल करें, maybe they won't stop using it. So इसके लिए you have to explain why this policy has been put in place and what the use of plastic bags is doing to the environment. Because nobody wants कि उनके marine pollution की वजह से turtles ख़त्म हो जाएं or even any other species in our rivers, in our oceans. Everybody wants to go to the beach and have a clean environment. But that connection of explaining कि अगर आप इस ban को follow करें, then our environment will become so much cleaner. And the beautiful tourist areas that we have in Pakistan will be protected. So I think there needs to be more of a connection on that. And जब communities इस बात पे ownership लें कि ये हमारी माहौल है and we're protecting it, then I think the enforcement of this will become so much easier because the push is coming from the individuals. So I definitely think in terms of awareness, that needs to increase, and giving individual communities ownership over these policies. And it shouldn't be seen as कि government हमें कह रहे हैं कि ये मत करो, but we don't know why. So I definitely think it is possible, and it's about building that public consciousness.
I mean, I understand the issues in the advocacy and not essentially the policy itself. And of course, once the people are convinced, what could potentially stop such a policy to take ground? With that being said, also make me understand a little. अभी बार ये बात डिस्कस होती है, पाकिस्तान की एक बहुत मेजर फीट समझा जाता है जो लॉस एंड डैमेज के प्लेजेस की बात हुई थी. Globally, we were being seen as okay, we're taking the lead in this entire climate issue. फिर बार ये भी सुनने में आता है कि climate की तो इतने Pakistan is not responsible for what's going on. But essentially, I also feel like that is also sort of a counterproductive argument to make, because then what you are demanding will not actually be fulfilled. आप अभी तो ये सब कुछ नहीं कर रहे, but there's a chance of you doing that much because we as a country have to grow. So at a certain point, we will be exceeding our current emissions or whatever जो भी वो सारा processes का. Again, I'm also a layperson in this field. So make me understand कि अभी जो हम लोग जिस तरह we're asking for this loss and damage pledges, पहली तो is there an already existing ground for this, and what essentially is Pakistan and other countries demanding from this? Because अभी तक तो हमें अपने colonial reparations नहीं मिले, तो one could say कि पूरी दुनिया में climate तबाही कर रहा है, why would we be the only ones demanding such things?
So this discussion on loss and damage, I'd start off by saying that Pakistan's efforts have been incredible in it. Last year, the advocacy at COP27 was unparalleled. We haven't had it before from a Pakistani delegation. Pakistan was chair of the G77 negotiating bloc, and through that, they were really able to get loss and damage on the agenda, but also get this fund. And the next thing is what is this fund?
Exactly.
And इससे पाकिस्तान को क्या benefit मिलेगी? And I think that is the one thing that we've kind of stopped at. We've said that these disasters are taking place in Pakistan. Pakistan needs funding for loss and damage. But how is the average person in Pakistan going to benefit from it?
Exactly.
So for that, I think we go back to defining the terms. What is loss and damage? And the way you understand that is through the other areas of climate change. So there is mitigation, which is कि हमें अपने CO2 emissions को reduce करने की ज़रूरत है, and because these CO2 emissions lead to global warming, lead to climate change and the impacts that we're facing. Then there's adaptation, कि climate change हो रहा है, but how can communities protect themselves against it? So these are things like making sure कि हमारे infrastructure में climate change की, the concept of climate change is incorporated into our building, into our infrastructure, to make sure कि जब ये climate change events होते हैं, how we can be resilient through those. And then you come to loss and damage. Loss and damage is the last leg of this, because it is the losses and the damages जो कि can't be escaped through adaptation.
Okay.
So that is, even if our adaptation efforts are at 100%, हमारी loss and damage still will take place. And these losses are for individual people, but also for Pakistan. So it includes the loss of lives that takes place in flooding, the loss of your cultural heritage, कि अगर आपके cultural sites तबाह हो जाएं और ये we can't rebuild them. It's also the loss of communities.
I would just like to interject a little here. This is essentially where the point of contention also arises, when we start defining कि ये जो हमारे pledges हैं या funds हैं in terms of the loss and damage, ये यहाँ जाएंगे. Make me understand ki how does that like change the situation, because essentially we're just getting money, and the farmer on ground who lost his crops, who will still be living on the same ground, which is likely to be flooded again. How does that change anything for that person?
So it's kind of giving them a remedy. And it isn't perfect, because there's certain things, and these are classified as non-economic losses and damages. So वो चीज़ें जिस पे we cannot put a price. So we cannot say the loss of your family member is worth this much, or the loss of your community, or but we can say कि the loss of your house costs this much. So that is also part of the economic loss and damage.
ठीक है.
So in that sense, your livelihood, your house, your the infrastructure, all of these things would come into things that we need to then quantify.
Sahi.
So I think that also is the next step that Pakistan needs to take in ensuring that we understand how much we have lost. And they are estimates, but we need to make an effective system to quantify this.
Sahi.
And then once we have that, then we know where money needs to go and who needs that money, and then what they do with that is up to them in terms of using it. But this has been an issue in loss and damage. It's not really set in stone. So this is it's a new field, it's evolving, and there are a lot of different arguments on how we should approach operationalizing or giving out money in loss and damage funds, whether that should be through the government or through local government, or whether that should go to the individual or the establishment institution. And so it's evolving, but I think Pakistan needs to move forward and then also make sure that we are giving our opinions on what people need. So we need to be getting a lot more information from communities affected by climate change.
All right, that's interesting. Following up with what Pakistan needs to do, the National Adaptation Plan 2023, is it in line with the idea and the concept that you have just shared?
So again, the National Adaptation Plan, it's been in the works for a couple of years, and it just came out recently, and I would recommend that everybody go read it, see what Pakistan has said it will do.
Do simplify it a little for us and our audience.
So again, adaptation is how your communities are able to adapt to the issue of climate change. And I know that doesn't give much of
No, it's perfectly fine.
Of an insight, but basically this is a requirement under the Climate Change Convention. So there's the Cancun framework that requires that every country should have a adaptation plan. And some countries have already produced theirs, are working on the second edition of their plans, but this is Pakistan's first plan. And basically what this looks at is it divides Pakistan into 6 sectors, and then in each sector it says कि हमें ये करना है ताकि we can adapt better to the impacts that we know are coming. So those sectors are agriculture and water, natural capital, urban resilience, and this is a really important one because urban flooding, urban heat are really big issues which we haven't been able to adequately plan for.
We're like facing it all right now.
Yeah.
As it is happening.
And then you have your human capital, disaster risk management, and then there's a special section for gender, youth, and social inclusion. And so what this policy basically does is it gives Pakistan some medium-term goals and then long-term goals. So this is what we will get done in the medium term, and then eventually what we are planning to get done. And it sets out that this organization will be in charge of this, this ministry is in charge of this. But it just makes sure that in every area, all of these areas, we're looking at 10 years down the line, what do we need to do to adapt to the impacts that we know will be coming from climate change. So it's a great effort, and I think there needs to be a lot of ownership in making sure that this happens. And in that sense, I think the Pakistani Qaum is really good at ensuring that when we get a policy or a plan, we make sure that the government follows through on it. And we saw that in the Azhar Lakhari case. Pakistan had released their national climate change policy and the framework for implementation of it. But the case was filed at a time where we were reaching the end of the date for short-term actions. And the petitioner realized that Pakistan hasn't done most of these. So he took this matter to the court. He said that this is violating my right to life, right to dignity. And the court, after that, established a commission to first collect data, see what we've done so far, and then set out a plan to actually enforce it. So now that we have this national adaptation plan, it's up to communities to read it, understand it, see where it's lacking, and then recommend how to improve it. But also make sure that once that medium-term deadline reaches, that our government is actually doing what it said it was going to do. And in this, I think there's always space to improve. There are other countries who are way ahead of us in this, and we can always look to them for guidance, ask for their best practices. Ek to is Bangladesh. They have a very similar climate, but they have been working on this issue for a while now, and they have a very detailed adaptation plan. So I think the next step is that our adaptation plan is up to that standard. But for now, it's really good that we have this out, and I'm looking forward to seeing in the next few years what happens with this.
So, because I come from an international relations background, mere andar wo ek constant nagging hai to push this question to you. I'm not sure if I'll be able to articulate it the right way, but make me understand, since environmental law, I'm assuming this is what we call it, environmental law, is still in process. The work is going on, right? There's no particular booklet out there or proper legal document out there, right? So I want to understand then that jo environmental concerns hain during conflicts, is there something going on with that? We're seeing the Russia, Ukraine in Europe. Afghanistan is still in the worst disastrous state that it can possibly be, post-war. They're facing issues. Is the environmental law going to look into, stuff like that? We had the Geneva Conventions to see कि क्या चीज़ें इस्तेमाल हो सकती हैं warfare के दौरान. The IHL was established, right? So I want to understand if this sort of framework is also under discussion, anything that you could guide us about. And also, leading from this point, the geopolitical use again of this particular international law in pushing states down. We saw how with the FATF and ourselves done great work on that matter as well. तो उस पे भी पाकिस्तान को किस तरह से कॉर्नर किया जा रहा था. Within this particular domain, we saw Pakistan take the lead. But chances are that this could be just the next geopolitical tool to push, to corner a country into isolation again. Your take on this?
That's a really good question. So I'll start with the first part on conflict-affected societies. And isme, in terms of international law, you have a lot of different regimes that address this situation. So you have international environmental law, which is made up of our multilateral environmental agreements. And then you come into this debate, do they apply to conflict settings? And it's a huge debate. You can read pages and pages on it, but it's currently still debated. Then you have international humanitarian law, and that sets out the principles for how states need to act in during a conflict. And so on this, there's actually been work by the international, the ILC, on making these draft principles on protection of the environment in relation to armed conflict.
All right.
So these were recently adopted only, and what they set out is all the obligations for states, for non-state actors, for corporations in conflict-affected societies. So corporations have to have higher due diligence standards. They need to ensure that they are not contributing to the conflict through their actions in that region or contributing to environmental degradation. There's also a separate section on occupation and how these environmental protections take place or should apply during an occupation.
Okay.
But the issue with these draft principles is that they are just draft principles.
Mm-hmm.
They are not legally binding on all states, and during negotiations on defining these draft principles, a lot of states didn't want them to be legally binding because they thought that these principles go beyond the scope of what is already included in international humanitarian law or international
That is
environmental
interesting.
law. Because what the ILC does is that it codifies the law,
Mm-hmm.
existing environmental law, but it also progressively interprets it. So some principles are exactly what is codified in the law, but some principles are progressive interpretations, little bits have been added, and they're looking at a more holistic scope because they look at the state before armed conflict, during armed conflict, and then
And
after.
then post-war, yeah.
So in terms of rebuilding societies, the transition to a post-conflict society, they look at that as well. And that was seen as going beyond what international law has set out.
I am very interested into why it's being considered beyond what international law has set out, because essentially, from what you've said, my understanding is that is allowing each country to secure a good environment despite all the conflict that happened. It's probably just paying more to the one who lost, I'm assuming.
So yeah, it is. It's interesting to see liberal democracies that champion human rights and protection of their people. But when it comes up to taking away their right to act in a certain environment, because it would restrict, if countries are to enter into war, their ability to carry out activities would be restricted, and they'd have to consider, is the environment being protected? So I think in that sense, they just don't want to give up that ability. So it is very interesting, and one thing I would recommend is to go and look at the statements from different states, because then you also see this north-south division. You have these third world democracies that are fighting for the protection of the environment because those are the countries where these conflicts have been taking place and the ones that have suffered the most because of it. So they want increased protection. But often you'll see a lot of first world countries who will be unwilling to give them that right. And then they block it to the extent that these are only principles that each country has commented on and they've accepted, but in terms of enforcement, there's not really space for that.
I'm assuming Russia's about to get a lot more charges. So on the idea of these laws being used to corner Pakistan again.
Yes. I think this is a criticism of international law that we've been hearing for a really long time.
I mean, is it just a narrative at home?
I think obviously there is truth to the statement that, and especially with international law that was created when a lot of third world states were going through the process of independence. So their ability to contribute to the development of international law at that time was really limited. So they kind of were born into this system where they hadn't created the rules and they were then forced to abide by them. And this is also the critique that you'll find in third world approaches to international law, which is a critical movement that basically criticizes this this aspect of environmental law, of international law, that it is made by the first world for the first world and it's used to subjugate the third world. And there've been a lot of international lawyers who have who have recognized this and criticized international law, but then tried to work within the fold of international law to amend it and to make sure that it does reflect the interests of the third world. And while it's interesting, I think to consider what a world without international law would look like, because there are some scholars who say that international law as a whole is predatory and it will always be predatory, so we need to do away with it. But then you come back to real life and you realize that's not possible.
I mean, you get to hear often कि UN ना होता तो सब ठीक होता. That doesn't sound really well. I know कि COVID के दौरान वो जो एक उसका breakdown हुआ था ना global institutions का, this is something that Dr. Adil Najam, you know, flagged in our minds quite recently. It was during COVID that the entire global institution system just had a little pause कि oh अब क्या करें. I guess we'll have moments like those, but again your point in case that फिर without it क्या होता.
Yeah, and I don't think that it's possible for third world states to abandon it. We will always have to work within the structure. So then it's how do we make the structure work for us? And this is something जो international law में, climate change, environmental law में we've been seeing recently. And you saw it at COP27 last year, the conference of the parties, वहाँ the G77 banded together to get the loss and damage fund. This was something that they were trying to do for decades. And they were finally able to do it because they had that critical mass. And so, in my opinion, I think, sure, this is used against the third world, but the third world can rally together with other like-minded states who are going through the same thing. And then they can ensure that these rules are changed. There are a lot of international treaties that are being negotiated now, and including the plastics treaty. So there's another negotiation session that's going to happen in November this year. So when third world states get together at those sessions and they ensure that their interests are reflected in the text of the treaties, that's when I think we'll finally stop hearing this this idea that international law or these specific areas of law are being used against the third world. So I think it's all about building that coalition of like-minded states and ensuring that you get your voices heard. Because I think that's happening, and third world states are also building their influence in the international legal order. So I definitely think it's possible, and I want to see more third world lawyers, more people who critique this aspect of international law, but then actually act on it as well.
And add into the field. You've left me at the end with quite a lot of questions, but I guess those are for another time, because the debate on the efficacy of the existing international order, that's one of the interesting things that's happening right now, given current events that are happening globally. With that being said, Maha, it was a pleasure speaking to you. I have a lot of questions that I could ask you right now, but I guess those are for a separate time. Thank you so much for taking out the time, and thank you so much everyone for joining us in this episode of Policy Beats.